the global justice online. I'll be your host today. The Center for Global Justice is a robotic research and learning center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. We've been doing these online webinars since the pandemic, and with that, we have not had our normal revenue generating programs. And so we depend upon you to make donations so that we can continue to offer these webinars and to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today, we are observing May Day, a day late, but I wanted to open with an appropriate bit of music.
Speed it up. Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners of want. That's right. For reason in revolt now thunder. Chains of hatred, greed, and fear. Ha ha! Away with all your superstitions. Serve our masses. Arise, arise. We'll change henceforth the old tradition and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come on and rally. Then the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race. No more deluded by reaction. On tyrants only will make war. The soldiers too will take strike action. They'll break ranks and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us to their pride, each at the forge must do their duty, and we'll strike while the iron is hot. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole beautiful human race. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. Ha! And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race.
Can't hear you, Cliff.
Why doesn't Andre just begin and then we'll see what anybody works out later on. There you go. Come forward again.
I don't know what it is, but my sound seems to be very unstable this morning.
If you're using an external mic, why don't you take that out and see if the internal mic is better?
No, it's not an external mic. It's built into my laptop.
Oh. In that case, have you got an external mic you could try?
The video and the video, you could hear the video sound without any problem. But
We can hear Andre. Why doesn't he?
well, actually, Helen's going to go first. And
Okay.
Whoever.
All right. Well, I'll take over from Cliff, even though this is not my event. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thanks to Cliff and the Centre for Global Justice for inviting me to come back and talk. I spoke almost a year ago. It was the 3rd of May, I think, last year, where I did a book launch. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'd appreciate, personally, when I speak, I love seeing your faces, the people I'm talking to. So if you feel like turning your camera on, that would make me very happy. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
yes.
Yes.
Is it big screen or small with two slides? Can someone just tell me? Are you seeing?
It's big screen. You see one slide at a time.
Right, brilliant. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about the 7 webinars about Cuba's challenges today, and I've been asked to talk for about 15 minutes. So I'm going to aim for about 20. And I'm going to fly through this, and there's a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, Andres is going to be talking about the US blockade, and actually it's very hard to talk about Cuba's challenges today without making it all about the blockade. So I'm going to go through looking at different aspects, but the blockade will come up, of course. And the other thing to say is I have sort of highlighted problems, weaknesses, challenges, deficiencies, but this should not be understood as assuming that I come from that perspective, that that's all I see. I'm very cognizant and inspired by the achievements and contributions that Cuba has made, and how the Cuban development example provides a very important alternative of global interest. So this is me and the title of a couple of my books, and recently I've helped to co-produce 2 documentaries, one about Cuba's response to COVID-19 and the other about Cuba's response to combating climate change, which is something I'll discuss. Now, when I spoke a year ago, I started with this slide because it's part of the way that I formulate or present Cuba as a country of contradictions. So after 1959, as all of you here know, Cuba was transformed, or Cubans transformed the island from a semi-colonial underdevelopment status to a sovereign socialist state, initially integrated into the socialist bloc, trade and investment, but subsequently after the collapse of the USSR, it has survived for longer without that other support. The revolutionary process forged a new state, dismantled old institutions, created a new apparatus with new social relations, new alliances, new political priorities, and new battles. So everything that we discuss about Cuba, everything that it has struggled to achieve, all of its obstacles must be understood within that framework. For over 60 years, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a poor country with world-leading human development indicators, a small island that mobilizes the world's largest humanitarian assistance, a weak and dependent economy, but has survived economic crisis and the US blockade, the most extensive, longest enduring modern blockade. It is considered, often described, particularly by journalists, as anachronistic, and yet it is innovative. We have incredible developments in medical science, for example, the COVID-19 vaccine. Formerly, Cuba is ostracized because of its differences and its alternative development, and yet it has millions of ardent defenders around the world. And despite meeting many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba is not upheld as an example. So these are contradictions that are worth exploring. Now, I'm going to briefly race through these issues in terms of challenges today: the economy, political issues, social issues, international relations, and then the environment. And I've put a picture here of Ricardo Alarcón. I suspect that all of you here will know that Ricardo Alarcón died yesterday. Cuba was celebrating International Workers' Day, but it also mourned the loss of one of its key figures in driving through that process of transformation, which I described. And Alarcón has played quite an indelible, has made an indelible contribution to many of these areas, which I'm going to discuss, particularly in terms of politics, international and domestic, but also social engagement and provision as his role as president of the National Assembly, and of course, international relations. He was Cuba's representative to the United Nations on and off for 30 years. He was also the Minister of Foreign Relations before becoming president of the National Assembly. Okay, so in terms of the economy, well, last time I came to speak to the Centre for Global History, I focused on what I call the challenge of development, which is a challenge that faces the majority of the world's population, the global South countries, as we call them today. But for Cuba, this is more complicated because Cuba has decided that to resolve the historical legacies of imperialism, colonialism and imperialism, and the unequal terms of trade, that the route to development lies in using socialism as a lever. So, you know, these are big questions like, how do developing countries get the capital they need to invest in the infrastructure and social welfare for their populations? How do they access that capital in a way that doesn't compromise their political independence and economic sovereignty? So, you know, these are very broad issues, and we should understand Cuba's endeavor within that broad framework. More specifically, Cuba as a small island nation, historically, in the present, and no doubt in the future, has by its sort of characteristics a dependence on foreign trade and on foreign capital. The Cubans have undertaken a national development plan, a reform process, which requires substantial foreign capital because they cannot accumulate. It's a small island with a small domestic market. They cannot accumulate it domestically. And that is to make these vital investments in infrastructure and social welfare to see the kind of GDP improvements that they set out as part of their plan. So they need something like 2 billion to 2.5 billion of foreign capital a year. And yet they are suffering, they are obstructed by historic and present foreign debt, budget deficit. A lot of this comes from a shortage of foreign currency, low productivity and wages. And we can discuss all of these issues, where they stem from and how they are trying to overcome them. Accessing foreign capital is extremely difficult for Cuba because they want to preserve the integrity of the socialist state. They have opted for foreign direct investment and remittances as the main forms of introducing foreign capital into Cuba. But the US policy has been designed very specifically to obstruct Cuba's access to both foreign direct investment and remittances. And so I've mentioned the reform process, which was really formalized, well, first initiated 2008 under Raúl Castro, and then formalized with the guidelines for updating the Cuban economy from 2011. And we should be clear that this introduces contradictions into Cuban socialism. The more that they open up spaces for the market mechanism and private accumulation, the more that that creates contradictions So Cuba is balancing as it moves forward between the plan on one side and the market on the other. Can you still hear me? I'm getting a message that my internet connection is
For about 3 seconds.
stable.
We can hear you now. You
Yeah,
had one
okay.
little break. You had one little break,
Okay.
but it's okay.
I'll persevere. And then, of course, more recently and specifically, you had the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Cuba. Cuba did the very sensible thing from an epidemiological point of view. It closed its borders, but it lost massive revenues from tourism on which it is very dependent. But in addition to the loss of revenue was the increase of costs, because they introduced medical quarantines, they mobilized the whole public healthcare system, the whole social infrastructure, and made sure that the costs were met by the state. And that meant a massive drain on their shrinking resources. In the midst of this, we had the decision to finally unify the currencies. And this was after 3 decades of a country operating with a dual currency. And what happened as a result of that, some predicted results, some much more serious than predicted, but it compounded existing goods shortages, which have included food and medicine, so very serious, very essential goods, and has led to inflation, which is a new shock for Cubans. In a state economy where the state can control prices, inflation is, usually not so apparent, except for this kind of trauma. So it's been a very big shock to Cubans to experience this inflation. And in general, we have global economy price rises in response to, global issues, including the war in Ukraine, but before that, also a cost of living crisis. And now sanctions on Russia, which, as I detailed in an article for Jacobin recently, Jacobin magazine, will impact Cuba directly in several ways, through the expected tourist visitors from Russia, through possibly obstructing development plans and investments from Russia in railways, in power generation and other areas, and because Cuba can use Russian banks to bypass financial sanctions by the United States. So all of this increases the burden on the socialist state, because people in Cuba are not left to sink or swim. Individuals are not abandoned. In terms of politics, the challenges for Cuba, for the Cuban state, are to sustain an ideological commitment to socialism. And, this is in a context where Cuba is politically isolated in this sense, and neoliberalism is globally dominant. Cuba has a counter-hegemonic system of people's power. I've just put in there, some little boxes to sort of show how it goes. So it's hard for Cuba to both be committed to that and defend that, and have buy-in, in a sense, from the population that this is a more authentic and genuine way of organizing representation and democratic structures. They've also faced the challenge in the last few years of legitimizing the new leadership. So you have Miguel Díaz-Canel, a man born after the Cuban Revolution, and the need for the new, younger leadership that's not part of the veterans of the Cuban Revolution to gain authority, trust, and respect from the population in the way that the historic leadership certainly did have. So maintaining engagement more generally is a big issue, being fully representative. I would say that Cuba has continued to make really big strides in this area. So it's quite small here, but in the orange box, it shows that after the 2018 elections of 605 delegates in the National Assembly, 53.2% were women. That's the world's second highest level. 40.6% were Black or mixed, which is more or less the same as those who self-define in the census, or even slightly more. And 13.5% were under 35, which I also think is very significant. Politically as well, it's a sort of economic political question. Cuba is going through a process of decentralizing budgets and decision making to local areas, but this requires resources. To be able to say to a municipality, you make decisions about local investments and improvements, you need to also make sure that they have access to resources and that there is accountability. So those are big challenges too. And then we have external influences, and we can talk about US funding for what they call democracy programs and Cuba calls regime change programs. There's clearly a manipulation of the issue of human rights and freedom, and Cuba confronts a very hostile rhetoric on that, globally speaking. Arguably, there is something we can call a social media war, which is a program that has been developed under the regime change programs. $20 million as a minimum is what is overtly approved by the US Congress every year, and all sorts of political machinations in the political field, domestic and international. But beyond that, Cuba has the issue of addressing emerging identities and emerging demands. So that might be, new movements in Cuba for animal rights, LGBT, or for cultural forms, and so on. So the challenge is to create forums for these peoples and demands, despite the fact that they are aware that there is an attempt to exploit this development through regime change programs. Okay, in terms of society, there has been the phenomena of growing inequality that is linked to questions of remittances and what's going on overseas, and the sort of racial legacies of emigration and so on. But it's also a response to a social impact of the economic reforms. So allowing people to set up their own businesses. You can look just with one statistic, the percentage of women professionals in Cuba is something like 66% of all professions. But in terms of business owners of private businesses, is just 8%. So this is having an impact in terms of that, and of people who have had state welfare cut, which they were accustomed to. Inadequate housing and transport and other public infrastructure, these of course are problems that can't be redressed unless there are resources there. So Cuba is constantly facing resource constraints which require it to prioritize. And in the last couple of years, COVID-19 and addressing the global pandemic has clearly been a priority, and it means many other issues have been pushed back. So what we have seen, in addition to this, is growing consumerist aspirations and an individualistic culture. I think we can talk about that more in the discussion. I'm aware that I'm already at 15 minutes. And this is manifested as well in discontent and disengagement. So July the 11th, I've written about this. I was in Cuba at the time. And while it's important to recognize the extent of outside manipulation and again, the social media war, there clearly was, hundreds or thousands of Cubans who went out to protest and who had legitimate complaints and grievances. And I'm not saying anything that the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel himself, hasn't said. So, this is particularly a problem for people who are outside work and employment in general, everywhere. But if you think about Cuba's response to COVID-19, how they shut down all schools, colleges, universities, and they shut down workplaces, that meant you had millions of more people than would normally be not engaging in workplace forums or study forums. Okay, sorry, that should say outside study and employment. So we've seen, particularly in the last year, rising emigration from Cuba. This is particularly young Cubans, Cubans who are not necessarily political opponents, but they are seeing their life plans being played out elsewhere, where they believe they have more opportunities. And of course, those who are just exhausted by the daily struggle, which Cubans have had to confront since the Trump administration increased sanctions, and we've had these foods and goods scarcities and so on, which I'll come on to. Okay, so how has the Cuban government responded? Well, it's been very interesting. In my book, which I talked about it the last time I was here, I have a chapter on the Battle of Ideas, which was when after the Elian Gonzalez affair, when they had this huge socio-economic programs to address deprivation, inequality, youth unemployment, and so on. So in a sense, there are signs that there are a return to at least that methodology. And we've seen the president, president of Cuba, the president of the Cuban street committees, Gerardo Hernandez, one of the Cuban Five, and other leaders going into the barrios, going into the poor communities. They went first to where the July the 11th protests were most violent, and they are talking to people, finding out about their conditions, finding out about their complaints, and to the extent that's possible, addressing those and re-engaging those communities in the organizations of the masses and the community mobilizations. And then you have a more generic issue, which has been, developing through the 6 decades of the revolution, which is tackling discrimination and prejudice, whether that's on the issue of race, sex, gender, identity, sexuality. And of course, Cuba is currently undergoing huge nationwide debate and public consultation about the new family code. And they recently set up a new commission to address racial prejudice, and that is being presided over by the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. Okay, international relations. Well, Cuba has continued to be a vociferous, or speak vociferously its anti-imperialist message in international forums, so supporting the struggles, for example, in Palestine and Western Sahara and other areas, and having a message against imperialism. Cuba today has diplomatic relations with 195 countries. That's more than the number of countries that are in the UN. And that's precisely because it has diplomatic relations with those 2 countries, which I mentioned, that aren't in the UN, Palestine and Western Sahara. And that's up from 50 in 1958. So we can draw conclusions there about the failure of a US policy of political and international isolation for Cuba. And we all know about Cuba's incredible medical collaborations. Again, this is a 6-decade history and development assistance which has taken place throughout the global south. And most recently with COVID-19, they, for the first time, sent a medical brigade to Europe, and that was to Italy, and then to another place too. And the world has responded. There's a lot of solidarity back from the world, global condemnation of the United States blockade or embargo. I've put here a screen of the vote last year in the United Nations General Assembly. Cuba every year, I think this is the 29th year, puts forward a motion to condemn the US blockade. And as you can see, it was 184 countries in favor, 2 against, and 3 abstentions. So other things that have impacted Cuba internationally recently was the crisis in Venezuela. The economic impact on Cuba was very significant because Venezuela was not able to send the same level of oil and or pay for the medics who continued to operate, the Cuban medics who continued to operate there. And a loss of allies and trade partners in Latin America with the swing to the right. So, with Bolsonaro, they withdrew something like 13,000 medics from Brazil, the same with Bolivia and Ecuador. But this may be swinging back. So we'll see whether those relationships are going to increase. Certainly, Almo in Mexico has opened a door for Cuba. And of course, in terms of international relations, and Andres is going to talk more about this, is the tightening of the United States blockade and hostility under the Trump administration. During the administration, 243 new action, sanctions, and coercive measures were added to a set of laws and legislation which was already 60 years old. So, and that included over 50 measures taken during the pandemic. So when international organizations were asking countries not to implement sanctions that would impact a country's capacity to tackle the global health crisis, they were doing the opposite. And Biden has, of course, as we know, not reversed any of those, and in fact added some sanctions of his own. And as I already mentioned, sanctions on Russia will also impact on Cuba. Okay, so the final category I was going to cover is the environment. Now, Cuba has a world-leading record in sustainable development, and that has been recorded in several scientific reports that have been produced, particularly since 2016 with the World Wildlife Fund, saying at that point, Cuba was the only country in the world to have achieved sustainable development, which meant raising the standard of living of the population whilst living within the carrying capacity of their ecosystem. And this is the result of a conscious environmental policy. It's not just the result of being a poor or underdeveloped or very little industrialized country. It is the result of an incremental policy focus on preserving and protecting the environment and natural resources. So Cuba today is responsible for 0.08% of global CO2 emissions. And despite that, it is experiencing increases in hurricanes, drought, torrential rain, water deficit and flooding. And all of those are highly costly in economic as well as human terms. Rising sea levels threaten to submerge 10% of Cuba by the end of the century, wiping out coastal towns, polluting water supplies, destroying agricultural lands, ruining tourist beaches and forcing 1 million people to relocate. That's 9% of the population. When you think about the shape of Cuba, it's a long, thin island. So what did Cuba do about it? In 2017, the state approved Tarea Vida, which is the state plan to confront climate change. And it has a projection up to the end of the century. But we have to understand that it wasn't just plucked out of nowhere. It is the culmination of decades of ecological research in Cuba. So under Tarea Vida, climate scientists, ecologists, and social scientists work alongside local communities, specialists, and authorities in adaptation and mitigation activities. Within Cuba, it's regarded as more than just an environmental policy. It is regarded as part of a new model of decentralized sustainable development. Because in order to carry out even the transition to renewable energies, the decentralization element is very important. So you're producing renewable energies in the regions where you're going to be consuming them. So, and in terms of climate problems, to make climate adaptation policies as suitable as possible, they have to be very specific to local conditions. And that's where community involvement is very, very important. So unfortunately, the United States obstructs Cuba's access to credit, including green finance, which it needs to really ensure that Tarea Vida can plow ahead, and to technology. So even early warning systems for, detecting hurricanes and so on has been blocked by the US blockade. And obviously Andres will talk more about that. Okay, so I recently wrote an article in Jacobin magazine under this title, "The US blockade against Cuba is an act of war." But, I think it's clearly demonstrated, as Alberto Navarro, the EU ambassador in Cuba in 2018 said when I interviewed him for my book, the biggest burden on development in Cuba is the US embargo. No doubt about that. Now, the interesting thing is the US embargo is a US law. There is no other country in the world that sanctions Cuba, and yet it interrupts and obstructs Cuba's trade with the rest of the world. The European Union, Britain, Canada, and other countries have what's called blocking legislation that protects their own entities and citizens from the US Cuba sanctions. However, they have failed to implement the legislation for fear of incurring the wrath of the United States and OFAC, that's the Office of Foreign Asset Controls of the US Treasury. So it's up to citizens in those countries to insist that they do implement their own legislation. And it's more urgent than ever to end the US blockade and finally give Cubans the chance to prosper and not just survive. And I've got here photos of a protest which took place in London just Saturday, 2 days ago, outside the HSBC Bank. HSBC has Cuba on its list of sanctions countries and recently inhibited, which means froze, the bank account of an association called Cubans in the UK, which was trying to send medical aid to Cuba to support the medical system and COVID vaccines. So these are the kind of actions that will be necessary. And that's where I will end. I've run slightly over, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Helen. It was good to hear from you again. A very comprehensive summary. And now let's give the floor to Andres.
Thank you, Cliff. And I want to thank the Center for Global Justice and all those attending this meeting right now. This is a very important conversation. I should first want to say that if we want a title, give me a title for my presentation. It's an emphasis on the US. It's the US economic blockade of Cuba. And what is the campaign to end that blockade? So I'm here to, many of us are already familiar with the history of the blockade. I'll talk a little bit about that. But really the question is right now, what can we do within the United States and within other countries to undermine the blockade and make it less effective? I also want to say as a prefatory remark that I, for many years, directed, excuse me, I directed a public policy program based at the University of California focusing on US policy issues that included immigration, US-Mexican relations, US-Caribbean relations. And now I'm heading a nonprofit whose work is to address issues of equality for Latinos and Caribbeans living in the US, but also working to empower communities by improving their relationships with their communities of origin in Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, and South America. And I also want to say, because this group is a group of people from the United States who, at least the Center for Global Justice, is based in San Miguel de Allende, the very special relationship that people from the US have with Mexico. And in fact, the largest sector of the expat community living in Mexico are Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants that go back to Mexico. And that the Mexican population of the United States, I was born in the United States, so I'm a US citizen of Mexican origin. There are 40 million of us in the United States. In comparison, there are 2.4 million Cubans in the United States. So we see the difference. But what's also important is that because of this engagement of Mexico and the United States, I think we have a perspective that's more as well informed by what occurs in Mexico as what occurs in the US. And I say that is because we understand that there is a long-term relationship of friendship between many people in Mexico with Cuba and with the Cuban Revolution. And as part of my senior years here, now being 68, I actually live part of the year in Mérida, Yucatan, and I am involved in a number of projects in Mexico City, and I'm holding a legal permanent residency in Mexico, while at the same time being a resident and citizen of the United States. So there's a lot of combinations, interactions, intersections here. Now let's go to the US economic blockade of Cuba. You know, actually, even before the revolution, the US government had executive actions restricting trade with Cuba. It began, curiously enough, in the late 1958 and 1959, when the Eisenhower administration used an executive trade blockade to prevent any arms shipments to the Batista government, because by that time, I think many people in the US government saw that Batista was going to fall and that his repression could not be hidden from the world stage. So there was actually a mechanism of a blockade even before the current version of the blockade, which unfortunately was signed on my birth date in 1960. In October of 1960 is the birth of the current blockade, which was in fact, an executive branch action. In fact, before Kennedy took office, this happened under the Eisenhower administration. That essentially, because of Cuba's economic relationship to the Soviet Union and agreements with the Soviet Union and the expropriation, among other things, of the refineries in Cuba of US firms, the US imposed the beginnings of the economic blockade as an executive decision in the Eisenhower administration on October 19th, 1960, the day I turned 7 years old. And through the years, the blockade, of course, has developed in many different ways. There was an increasing enforcement that occurred around the October crisis, when there was not only an October blockade, this was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States, but Kennedy, of course, also imposed a naval blockade as well as the economic blockade. In fact, I think the use of the term blockade in part was informed by that experience of having multiple types of blockades against Cuba. But it's also appropriate to call it a blockade and not just an embargo, because it really seeps into all parts of Cuban life, based through the economy, but through the strangulation of trade, through the attempt to prevent third country economic interaction. It's really an attempt to clamp down and completely isolate the Cuban economy and make it impossible for the Cuban economy to survive and prosper. And I think it's an honor. It's an accomplishment of the Cuban Revolution that they've been able to sustain the economy in the midst of an unprecedented economic war. Essentially, it is a declaration of war. And in this context of being under siege ever for 61 going on 62 years, the fact that they've been able to make the accomplishments that Helen's presentation underscored is something that we need to acknowledge and be impressed by the ability of the Cuban system to persevere and create the kind of economic model that it's created under a socialist system that under siege. In fact, I attended a very small group presentation made by Ricardo Alarcón, who we're remembering today. Alarcón discussed Cuba, and he said, "We are an island under siege, militarily and economically, and that we have to proceed on that basis." So from the Cuban perspective, this onslaught of a 62-year blockade is an act of war, and they have to act accordingly as being an island nation, a small island nation with a small economy under siege. Of course, the economic blockade, I'm going to bring it up quickly to 1996, had been an executive branch action, an executive order until 1996, when there was a bipartisan Republican Congress-led passage of the Helms-Burton Act, which was signed by Bill Clinton in March of 1996. And since that date, then the economic blockade of Cuba has now become public law. The only way to completely reverse the blockade is to overturn the law, which is very politically difficult in the United States, and we'll get into the details of that later. But it adds another layer of difficulty for Cuba and its friends in the world to overcome this blockade, because now we have to change public law, although there are some things that can be done at the executive level. Which brings us to the opening that was begun under the Obama administration. The Obama administration began to loosen a lot of the restrictions, because beyond the blockade itself, there have been historically a number of restrictions on Cuba related to the blockade, but also involving politics. And of course, the part of these involve limiting the amount of remittances that could be sent to Cuban families, the lack of consular services, the non-existence of diplomatic relations effectively between the two countries. And with the Obama opening, there actually were some very concrete things that were accomplished. Again, Western Union had a pretty free rein in managing remittances from Cuban families in the US and in Spain to Cuba. There was a reopening of the US Embassy in Havana, which began to offer consular services. There was an opening of travel, particularly for Cuban families. There was the opening of certain types of business. For example, Google signed agreements with the Cuban government And there were a number of advances in cell phone technology and the use of the mobile and cellular network as well as Wi-Fi. And yet we last year during the July 11th riots, there was a lot of discussion that said that Cuba didn't allow internet, which is a total lie, because during the Obama administration there was an opening of access to the internet. If anything, the internet is closed because of the blockade, because Cuban IP addresses are blocked by U.S. government U.S. government agencies. So that the real problem with the internet in Cuba is not in Cuba; it's with the United States blockade. So then let's fast forward to, of course, the Trump administration, and of course, Helen already explained that under the Trump administration, they added 243 sanctions to the existing actions of the blockade restricting Cuba. Not even the Russia today has the number of sanctions that Cuba has, or for the length of time that Cuba has had to face those sanctions. And at the same time, of course, the Trump administration started actively implementing aspects of the blockade in Helms-Burton that hadn't been implemented. For example, aggressively going after third-party banking transactions in European countries and in other parts of the world. And I would think that probably for those of you living in Mexico, there are a number of private sector banks in Mexico that are timid in terms of extending lines of credit to Cuba. Of course, the Spanish-owned banks already have relationships in Cuba, like BBVA, for example, Santander. They do have economic relations with Cuba, but particularly the U.S.-owned banks in Mexico are constrained by the blockade. But at least on the public policy side, with Andrés Manuel López Obrador's administration, you have a complete opening to Cuba. And there are some opportunities perhaps in Mexico to provide some leadership in economic relations with Cuba to help kick in a little bit that door, to break down that fence, that economic blockade fence that has been constructed by the US government, and its attempt to affect transactions on third nations, on third parties. Now, and also during the Trump administration, as a parting shot, in January of 2021, the Trump administration put Cuba on the list where it had been taken off of a country supporting terrorist activity. And to date, the Biden administration has not rescinded that declaration. In fact, it confirmed it this last year. So with the Biden administration, we have a mixed bag. In response to the protests of July 11th, 2021, the Biden administration was cautious, and it has not really made any attempt to publicly realign with the Obama opening. Although it kind of stealthily, they have reopened consular services at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. They have, in fact, they are beginning to issue visas in Havana. They're allowing a little bit more leeway on remittances, although there still is the sanction against using any company that's related to the Cuban state. There's some loosening on travel for Cuban Americans, but there's still much more to be done. And so what occurred last December, 114 members of Congress wrote a letter to Joe Biden, basically asking him to return to the opening of the Obama administration, as well as to do what he can to cease the implementation of the U.S. economic embargo and blockade. And in fact, we in the Bay Area, I noticed we have some colleagues, including Vicki Legion, working with us at Bay Area Cuba Saving Lives. We are going to have a public letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco. We're going to publish a public letter. We're going to have a number of signatures from a number of prominent elected and appointed officials in the Bay Area, asking Nancy Pelosi to allow legislation to overturn the blockade. She's blocked some attempts at putting some of this legislation on the docket. So we're asking her to allow debate and to support the 114 members of her body, particularly those who are Democrats, to do everything she can, working with the Biden administration, to rescind most aspects of the blockade with Cuba. In order to be able to move this forward, we're developing a number of solidarity we're working with existing Cuba solidarity organizations to build an alliance, working with those in the US Congress supportive of the rescission of the blockade, and making this the primary solidarity movement in the US relative to Cuba, perhaps aside from other solidarity work we're doing in terms of providing material assistance, food, and medical supplies to make sure that Cuba can succeed through the pandemic and can reestablish its economy in a post-pandemic world. So there are many things that we can discuss in the open discussion about what can be done in the US and in other parts of the world, particularly in North America, where Canada and Mexico have fairly close relations with the Cuban government, so that we can build a coalition, both nationally and internationally, to overturn for once and all the blockade, to shame the United States for its essential economic war against Cuba, and to support friendly relations and extensive open relations between the US society and the Cuban society. I will end with that, and I invite questions, and I'd be happy to engage in a conversation with this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and Helen. We want now to open the floor for questions. Since some of you are watching this on YouTube, in order for you to get a question or comment to us, you need to send an email to me at globaljusticecliff.gmail.com, and I'll pass your question on to those in the Zoom room. And those of you who are in the Zoom room, of course, you can present your question directly by raising your hand, waving at me, and I'll call on you. Who would like to raise the first question or comment? Okay, I see Bob Stone. Unmute yourself.
I'm very grateful to both of you, Helen and Andre, for this very encouraging report that there is finally going to be a fairly organized effort to undo this cruel, unjust, but cruel, mean law that is a shame on the United States. You mentioned some kicking the door open type of actions that could be taken. Andre, could you elaborate a bit?
Well, here, yeah, I'm Andres, by the way. Yeah, Andres with an S.
Perdón, Andres.
Mexicano.
Sí,
yes, there are many ways of kicking in the door. Again, this is going to take international work, but if we don't have a solid movement in the United States, we're not going to be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And really, most public opinion in the United States would oppose the blockade, because none of us support anything that restricts connections, communication, trade and tries to undermine other third parties from participating. One thing I forgot to mention, and I need to right now, it is going to be a long haul for us to overturn Helms-Burton under the current political conditions. And if the Republicans take over the House, it's going to be even harder. But there are other things we can do. But it's even, we don't even need to have Republicans. The chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is Bob Menendez, the Cuban American Democrat from New Jersey. He had a fit, for example, when the US delegation went to Venezuela in March to talk about maybe opening up lines of communication. He chastised the Biden administration. And he's basically told Biden administration that he'll sit on any State Department appointments if the Biden administration makes any attempt to return to the Obama opening. So here we have a Cuban American Democrat from New Jersey, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wielding a lot of power and being he's as bad as Marco Rubio when it comes to Cuba. And Joe Biden knows the power that Bob Menendez wields. So that, and in fact, again, I remind you that Joe Biden met with leaders of the Miami Cuban community twice in the Oval Office. I mean, no other community gets that kind of attention. So there's lots of political issues making it difficult to overturn legislatively the blockade. But you can eat away at the blockade, and that's where kicking the door comes in. One thing is to identify those companies that have been, starting in the Trump administration, companies in places like Canada, US, and Europe, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and the rest of Latin America that have been subject to legal action by the US Department of Treasury for their independent relations with Cuba. Those of us who are citizens of these countries should stand up for the companies in our countries that are having trade with Cuba and show that the people support that. You have more of a question, yeah.
Well, I live in Mexico. I'm
Right.
going to seek Mexican citizenship.
Right.
Is there anything special that we can do as expats? There are a lot of us in this country.
Right. I know that. Yeah.
To influence AMLO or get our fellow Mexicans.
Well, actually, what's interesting is the government is doing all it can. I mean, AMLO, every opportunity he has, he talks about he criticizes the U.S. blockade, says it's an impediment to international relations. It actually, and the Morena, not only Morena, but parties like PRI, but PRI and PRD as well are sympathetic to Cuba. The problem is the Mexican private sector. The thing is to identify companies in Mexico, particularly those that also have trade with the United States. They feel intimidated by the blockade, particularly if there are warnings that are sent to them. I think again, maybe the fact that many of the important banks in Mexico are in fact owned by Spanish companies, and most of them do have relationships with Cuba, particularly BBVA, Santander. There's another I'm missing. There's Scotiabank. A lot of the Mexican banks. The thing would be to identify, looking at U.S. records, identify those companies that have been approached by the Department of Commerce through the OFAC and the Treasury to see if any of these have been sanctioned or threatened in any way. It's public record. We can let's do some research on that. Now, the other thing is on the US side, the letter of the 104, this is the first time there was any letter of any group of members of Congress to any administration about the blockade. So 114 members of Congress writing a letter to Biden. Hopefully that kind of offsets a little bit Bob Menendez. you can't pass the law, but you can at least change the executive actions. You can eliminate all the special actions that Trump did, the 233 or 43. And you can also make sure that there is a full opening of consular services so Cubans can get visas in Cuba and not have to cross the border through Mexico. You know, we can make sure that remittances are allowed to the extent that the people want to send them to their families, that shouldn't be impeded in any way. That travel of US citizens to Cuba should not be impeded in any way. That we should continue to have having cultural, academic exchanges. And in fact, the other thing is there are about 270 US companies that have signed a letter to members of Congress saying that they want more open trade with Cuba. So let's work with the private sector, both outside of the US and inside the US, because those are ways of kicking down the door. Trump never built his wall to Mexico. Well, we got to break down this economic wall. I mean, Cuba, of course, is surrounded by water, but this adds another layer of encirclement, and we got to break that down.
Thanks, Andres. One last question. Is there a website that I can keep abreast of news on this campaign?
Sure. There's what I'll do. Let me send you the best. There's a couple I can think of, but instead, let me consult with my colleagues, and through Cliff, I'll put maybe on the center's website. We can put up solidarity with Cuba, and the blockade. In fact, there's already a hashtag. It's called, help me, Vicky. It's called
Unblock Cuba.
I'm sorry.
Unblock Cuba.
Unblock Cuba. There you go. Hashtag Unblock Cuba. Any website that has Unblock Cuba on it, that's the one you want to go to.
Great. Thank you very much. Please send all of that to Cliff. I want you to know that we're very early in Cuba Solidarity. Cliff's first trip, which I joined, was in 1982.
My first trip to Havana, my first trip to Cuba was 1978, in the 11th contingent of the Venceremos Brigade. Spent 5 weeks there. Incredible visit.
Wonderful. Keep up the good work, both of you, Helen. It's wonderful the work you're doing. We appreciate it from the heart. A lot of us have a lot of heart in Cuba, as you do, obviously.
Okay, let me bring Helen back into the conversation. I'd like to ask you about the July 11th demonstrations. One of the things that has been said that has contributed to that discontent was the fact that Cuba has been slow in carrying through some of the reforms that it had adopted over a decade ago now. And the feeling being that if they had been adopted more vigorously, that would have alleviated many of the hardships that people are now complaining about. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, right, this implies a sort of a critique of how fast you are moving towards an objective. So the critique depends on who the person speaking is and what they think the objective is. For those who see the reforms as a bridge towards opening or carrying out essentially a transition to capitalism, then there is indeed frustration. For those who see the reforms as in the way that I've tried to portray that I think the Cuban state sees them, is part of this ongoing 6-decade-long search for the solution to raise productivity and efficiency, but within a socialist framework and with incredible external constraints, then the apparently hesitant movement in terms of the reforms is more understandable. So it's a trial and error, it's a test and pull back. And, you know, where they have, and I mapped this out in my book, as I'm sure you know, on the 2 chapters, one on Raoul's reforms and the other on the, you know, the kind of contradictions that have emerged, the Cuban tightrope, you know, so the more that you open up spaces of the market and you say to people, you know, here's material incentives, go and pursue your private interest, go and accumulate private capital, the more that you are in the longer term endangering the socialist project. So that's why I call it a Cuban tightrope. It's an extraordinarily difficult balancing act. And, you know, it's full of contradictions. So on the one hand, you're trying to stimulate material incentives and the profit motive. And on the other hand, you're saying, no, it's limited because you can't accumulate more than, you know, 2 houses, one countryside, one in the city, for example. You can't accumulate more than, you know, 1 business. You can't have more than this number of seats in a paladar. You know, you have to pay this amount of tax, and the more you earn, the more tax you pay. So the point is, it's an extraordinarily complex process. Now, as I understand it, they have had to take measures out of expediency because of this essential problem, right? Going back to the challenge of development, they need foreign capital. Yeah, they don't have access to multilateral development banks. They're blocked by the United States. US sanctions, I mean, in that, you know, for writing about sanctions and going through the legislation, it clearly says that, you know, development banks that lend money to Cuba will have the same amount withdrawn from the United States. So there's all sorts of pressure and mechanisms to stop Cuba getting access to capital for investment in the normal way. I mean, it's totally absurd. I mean, no other country in the world that I'm aware of faces the kind of challenges that Cuba faces. And yet, how do you repair the roads? And how do you rebuild those crumbling houses? And how do you make the investment in the new laboratory at Mariel Special Development Zone to produce the COVID vaccines? So you're not using the laboratories that currently produce domestic medicines. You know, that's problems that they've had very recently. So notwithstanding that, I mean, you know, this is the perspective. If you see Raoul's reforms, as I call them, moving towards an embrace of capitalism, then you'd be disappointed and frustrated every time there's an effort to reassert state control over production or distribution. If you see them as this ongoing effort to say, well, our objective is to carry out a transition to socialism, which, you know, the Cubans talk about building socialism, not we're in socialism, building communism. If you see it as part of a transition, and, you know, we face these external constraints and internal constraints. So what new policies can we try which have this ultimate objective: increase productivity, increase efficiency within the socialist framework, because the ultimate objective is welfare-based development. Then you can understand the to's and fro's, the decisions, you know, to apparently open up to private interests and then close down spaces. However, saying all of that, there are inconsistencies which have and slownesses, that's not even a word, that have created frustration. So, you know, and that are that I can't particularly understand, although I'm not involved in policy making, so I'm not aware of the particular constraints. But one example is to allow people to have private businesses, and most of these are gastronomy by quite a big proportion. They're like, you know, cafeterias and restaurants and so on, but not give those private owners access to wholesale market. And what that means is that people are trying to supply a restaurant through a retail market, a supermarket, or a local store, or a local food and veg market. And that creates some of this shortages, because, you know, there's this famous case that was reported, I can't remember, by Roel Sanchez, you know, of these guys turn up at a supermarket and they bought, you know, I don't know what it was, 100 crates of 50 apples each, you know, and off they went. And it was all sort of money under the table, and the employees knew, and it was all totally illegal, but it was, or not illegal, but not legal, which is a distinction. And yet it was happening. So this is one example of where people have a criticism that is valid even within the framework of understanding that the Cubans have a specific set of objectives, and that at times they will take measures that cannot be understood from a capitalist political economy perspective, because they might decrease GDP, but actually they're taking because they will secure the welfare of sections of the population, or they will prevent an increase in inequality, or they will consolidate or ensure national ownership over scarce resources or natural resources, and so on. So often the Cubans make decisions which are easy to criticize when you're working within a capitalist paradigm, but they do have an internal logic. And as I'm saying, there are examples of inefficiencies in passing policy. And, you know, really, I mean, the speeches by Raúl and now Miguel Díaz-Canel have been very critical of, you know, what they see as officials or bureaucrats who are, you know, just holding back processes, taking too long. And they're saying, you know, we have to break an ideological mold which sees that private interests are reactionary and counter-revolutionary and, you know, want to overthrow the revolution. But it is challenging. I mean, another issue that gets criticized a lot is how long it takes to approve when a foreign investor has, you know, put forward all the paperwork. It's very demanding in Cuba for a foreign business. They have to meet extraordinarily complex and demanding criteria, which are not requested in Mexico, on you know, Nicaragua, where you have what they called, you know, those sorts of sweatshops. They're certainly not requested in Haiti, or probably you can easily say not in Britain or the United States. So, you know, they're very demanding set of conditions about the performance and the treatment of corporations towards the workers, yes, but also the environment. So that makes Cuba an undesirable place for foreign investors. They have to have a really good incentive, a really good pull factor. And when you add that to the Helms-Burton Act, which Andres was talking about, which is specifically designed to block or put off foreign investors at the point where Cuba was left isolated and was desperate to find new trade partners. But there was a question in the chat from before about who Cuba imports and exports from. So if that's all right with you, I'd just like to briefly say something about that, because it is quite a remarkable success story how Cuba has managed to diversify its trade and investments. I mentioned diplomatic relations, but we know that before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, 87% and 86% of imports and exports came from the Soviet bloc. Most of that was from the Soviet Union. And the impact of losing that, you know, more or less overnight was devastating. But the success story is quite phenomenal. So, you know, they massively diversified their trade partners, and not just with, or they didn't have the option, but, you know, not just with socialist countries or fraternal countries. So you know, people often, before the recent crisis in Venezuela, said, oh, Cuba's shifted its dependence from the USSR to Venezuela. Well, actually, that's not true. Cuba gets 23% of its imports from Venezuela. This is pre-COVID, these statistics, 23%. Compared to, you know, as I was saying, it was like 86, 87 from the Soviet Union, 13% from China, 10% from Spain, 4.5% from Mexico, which we are seeing is going to increase, 3.9%, or so let's say 4% from Brazil, and 44% from other countries, which go from Vietnam to the Netherlands, so all over the world. So they have really had remarkable success. And then in terms of exports, the biggest single group, again, I'm talking 2018, is Canada. Then you have, that's 22%. Then you have Venezuela, 20%, China, just 19%, Spain 7.6%, 5% Netherlands, and 26% other. So, you know, they export about 500 million, probably slightly less, in medical goods overseas. So their pharmaceutical and biotech products to 50 countries nearly, mostly in the global south. This is all pre-pandemic. I expect to see those numbers go up quite substantially. So, you know, that this is in terms of goods exports, but of course their biggest earners are from medical services and also tourism, which is in the service sector. So, and those remain, you know, the predominant sources of revenue, even despite what's happened with Bolsonaro and withdrawing the medics from Brazil. They have, you know, medics in Qatar, they have medics in Saudi Arabia, countries with which they have no political or ideological affinity. So they have been extraordinarily successful in that. The problem they have today, Andres was talking about these banks, you know, what really put the nail in the coffin in a sense was 2 days, I think it was, before Trump left, he added Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And this is following a period of cases against banks like HSBC, where they were done for money laundering, nothing to do with Cuba, but it means that they have much more heightened risk assessment processes. And as soon as a country is put on that list, it goes to, you know, junk status in terms of investments, and nobody wants to risk the OFAC fines for trading with Cuba, with any country on that list of sanctioned countries. And, you know, in that article I wrote in the Jacobin, just doing a bit of research around that, in the first 6 years of Obama, before rapprochement was announced, because let's not forget that it, you know, he didn't come in and embrace Cuba. It took him 6 years. He was halfway through his second mandate. The fines on European banks were something like $14.5 billion. So, you know, that, you know, as this guy, the EU ambassador to Cuba, said to me, we know that the EU should do more. We should implement our own laws. The problem is that Cuba represents something like 0.1% of our trade, whereas the US is more like 60%, and countries don't want to risk it. Now, I think what our role is, and this is what Andres is talking about, and, you know, the photos of the HSBC bank, is to change that political calculation. So we have to make the cost of not standing up against the blockade higher somehow than the cost of leaving the blockade in place. In terms of what can be done concretely, Bob, you were asking concretely of what can be done. I think demanding that Biden immediately remove Cuba from that list of sanctioned countries will have a tangible positive impact, will let Cuba breathe a little bit, because, you know, I've been talking about who it trades with, but if you cannot make financial transactions, you cannot carry out trade. Countries are not going to keep sending you rice and meat and wheat if you can't pay for it, right? They don't care why you can't pay for it, but, you know, they have to be paid. So that's one thing. I think it's also going to be really important to ensure that when, and I've no doubt they will, when the WHO, the World Health Organization, approves the Cuba's COVID vaccines, that, you know, the United States, I don't know the name of the administration, but recognizes Cuba's COVID vaccines, because that will affect the capacity not just of Cubans to visit the United States, but also of millions of people in the global South who are likely to have the Cuban vaccine as their only vaccine. So I think that's another really key campaign. And as Andres said, you know, there are measures that can be taken. There is the lawyer, Robert Muse, who argues that actually, because the president of the United States has authority constitutionally over foreign policy, they could just eliminate the laws of the embargo by a sweep of a pen. I don't know. I'm not a US legal or political expert, but, you know, that's an issue that should also be investigated.
Okay, I see Norma Harrison has her hand up, and Vicky Legion also. If there are others, I'd like to get a sense of how many people want to speak. If you can maybe raise your electronic hand, I can get a count that way, and we can pace ourselves accordingly. But now, Norma Harrison.
Hi, everybody. The comments that I supported Cuba virtually all my life because I'm very communist, almost by religion, as it were. So talking about all those places that have been named as already thwarting the U.S. effectively, and needing to get to encourage a coalescence of those people on principle, or those nations on principle. If we could develop a program, I mean, there's already some kind of program going on, so I don't think I'm proposing anything original, but I am emphasizing it if it is happening, to cause to encourage a coalescence of nations that would support opposing the United States and behave in an integral way with Cuba. The next thing is, I have mentioned to several lists in which I participate that half or more of the world nations are going in a communist direction. Somebody told me that was pessimistic, that all of them are, but which is all right. Which is all right with me. I mean, but I do think that half the world's nations are doing something in a communist direction, and so the idea of trying to pull those out of pull those into a list together and say, look, all of this is going on, United States, get with it, and show the enemy, the arch enemy, the error of its ways, and especially show the people. I mean, half the people in the United States think that all the right-wing behavior is totally acceptable. In fact, they don't even read it when there's some terrible thing by some arch right-winger going on. They don't even pay any attention to it. They just continue to go along with that program because it suits their innards, I'm sure. But in the meantime, there's the rest of us. And so I'm not talking about appealing to people in the United States. I'm talking about appealing to the nations that already have behaviors that indicate that they use socialist procedures in their construct of their environments, and threaten, and tell the United States, look, this is already going on. You need to drop the blockade against Cuba because all these people, all these nations don't agree.
Okay, we have 4 other questions pending. So let me ask Vicky Legan to put her question in, and then our speakers can respond to both of those.
Well, number one, I wanted to thank the speakers for a fabulous presentation. And also, I just wanted to make a comment about grassroots organizing that's happening all over the place. Like in San Francisco, we got the Board of Supervisors to pass a resolution calling for medical cooperation with Cuba. And, there's so many things that we need medically from Cuba, such as immunization of young children that is, driving parents to distraction here in the United States. I mean, and that's only one example. But so 48 cities have passed these unanimous resolutions all around the Bay Area. Every city has passed such a resolution. And, you know, I think that that's part of kind of heightening the contradiction where the Democrats promised in their platform to basically come back to the Obama policy, and then they did the exact opposite, you know, that we need to heighten that contradiction. So I did want to ask a question of Andres, which is for his thoughts about outweighing the Biden administration's electoral calculations about the Cuban American community in Florida with the potential weight of the Latin American diaspora in the rest of the United States that, you know, that does want relations with Cuba. So just, you know, as you said, the 2.9 million Cubans, all of whom are not against the government of Cuba. But anyway, so that's my question.
Let's take more questions. The other question.
Okay, Rita, do you want to put yours into the hopper?
Thank you. I am really grateful to both Helen and Andres. You know, the analysis and information is invaluable. Helen, I'm part of the Saving Lives national meetings bi-monthly. And so of course, thank you for your tour and your tireless work. It's an honor to speak to you directly. It's really a pleasure. You're spoken of so highly by everybody. What I want to mention, a couple of quick things, please. First, that there's a new issue, in case you haven't seen it, Monthly Review has put out an issue all about Cuba that's been edited by Vijay Prashad and Manolo de los Santos. And I just want to highly recommend it because it's a compilation of articles, and a few of the articles are by younger Cubans on the island who talk about the current challenges, and I think give us insight that we wouldn't get otherwise. So I think everything in that issue is important to understand. And I just want to say, from the Saving Lives Coalition for a second, we have a new campaign that's going to be launched soon. And I'm wondering, I say this, I'm wondering if Helen might be able to comment. There's been a lot of communication with people in health on the island, and the campaign is going to focus on solidarity, sending medical equipment and sutures and, you know, things necessary for operating, because they've had to hold off on so many surgeries. One of the main trauma centers, or the main trauma center, Calixto Garcia in La Habana, has a lot of operating rooms, but only 2 or 3 have currently operable anesthesia machines. And so we are going to launch a campaign to raise funds for to send some machines as well as other supplies. And and I'm just wondering if Helen could comment on from what you've gleaned as far as top priorities. And, I mean, I see, in addition to changing, of course, what we're saying about having to change these horrible rules and sanctions, I also see the great importance of sustaining and, showing the Cuban people that they have help from outside while things are so difficult. And I'm a public health person, so that's my focus. So I'll stop.
Yeah, let me quickly respond and let Helen have the last word. Quickly to Vicky's question. The problem really is the Cuban community, particularly the self-appointed spokespeople, from Miami-Dade were a creation of the U.S. federal policy itself, because right after the revolution, there was a decision that they would cultivate the creation of an enclave in Miami that would go back once the communist revolution was overthrown. And so it was dedicated US policy to create an enclave community based on a number of people who were wealthy Cubans. There was no complaint about Spanish language instruction and dual language instruction in Cuban schools as far back as 1961 in Miami. So this is a monster created by US politics. And it's about 2.4 million. There's no more than 2.4 million US of Cuban descent, US residents of Cuban descent. There are more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than Cubans. For some reason, there's two calculations. Bob Menendez is playing a big role, and he is threatening to make Biden's work more difficult. And he is protective of this elite in South Florida. Secondly, the Democrats still think that Florida is a toss-up state, and they don't want to give up that idea, particularly because it looks like there may be a serious campaign against Marco Rubio by Val Demings this year. So the US political calculation is they still are they're going to do their best not to anger the right-wing Republican Cuban elite in South Florida. And the last thing I want to comment on, and no other Latino ethnic group in the United States has that kind of power in the halls of power that the small minority of Cuban American elites have in Florida. Somebody really needs to call them out. The emperor with no clothes. This is a very small group of people, but they hold US foreign policy hostage, and we've got to stop that.
It's like the pro-Zionists, very few of the Jews.
That's correct. The Jewish community does not support AIPAC's solution for the Middle East. The other thing I want to say very briefly, and Helen can speak more to this, I think, and this is also comes up in the US Saving Lives campaign with Cuba, it's important to provide Cuba with material aid in health and in food for a couple of the following reasons. It's much more difficult for them to import food because of the blockade and the problem with getting financing and having to pay too much for financing and importing even human essentials. The other thing is the contradiction. Cuba has has a world-class biotech capacity. They created 5 vaccines, anti-COVID vaccines, but they didn't have syringes to apply the vaccines because of the blockade. It took the aid of other countries, and the US solidarity groups are very important, to supply the syringes needed to apply the vaccines that were created in Cuba. That is the blockade right there. That's the prime example. Thank you.
Okay, Helen.
Yeah, so thanks, Rita, for your very kind words. I hope I deserve them. Yeah, I mean, I think the work the Saving Lives campaign has done has been fantastically important for the reasons that you say, and the reasons Andres says. It's material aid, it's meeting a need, but it's also a political statement and, an act of solidarity. So solidarity flows 2 ways. It's very important. And it's one thing that I always point out. There is no animosity among the Cuban state, from this Cuban state, or among the Cuban population towards US citizens. I mean, to quite an incredible degree, actually. You don't go to Cuba and worry about telling anyone that you're from the United States, right? You're more likely to be embraced. So it is very important. And I would be completely guided by what the Cuban medical professionals say. and follow their lead. They are the ones who will know what their shortages are. But also it's the benefit of having a planned, nationally integral, comprehensive system is that you won't, I just remember like this business in the United States when at the beginning of COVID, and different states started trying to buy medical ventilators, and it was pushing up prices, and then they were sort of outbidding each other, and it was insane because the federal level, they could have imported and then distributed according to need or per capita. So I mean, that's one, we are seeing with global crises like COVID-19 and like climate change, actually the benefits of and arguments in favor of a state plan in the interests of welfare, right? So yes, absolutely be guided by what they say, because they'll be telling your organization that they want the sutras or whatever it was that you said, and they'll be telling another organization that they need the paracetamol for babies because it's run out, or antibiotics or diabetes medicine. So I think this is really important. And solidarity between the US and Cuba has always been key. And so have medical links always been key. I mean, I've written in my book, I have a whole chapter on the development of Cuban biotech, and there's a US oncologist who is part of that story, and there are others who tried to establish links between the Cuban Academy of Sciences and the US Academy of Sciences and organized trips. And although it was prohibited for people to visit Cuba, they went. Scientists went in their hundreds and thousands to US conferences to have exchanges. They went through third countries, they went through Mexico, they went through other places, and the Cubans embrace that sort of collaboration. So I think this is really important. But I also think, I mean, Vicky said something, which is a point that I make as well. And I think it's really worth embedding in your campaigning, right? That this blockade, these sanctions, focusing even just on the question of medical, in the medical sphere, impact US citizens. So when you talk about saving lives, you are also talking about saving lives in the United States, right? And the example that I often give is with the Heprapot P, which is the medicine, innovative Cuban product from their biotech sector for diabetic foot ulcers, which it has been calculated would spare over 50,000 US citizens or US residents from having to need amputations every year. Over 50,000 a year. So, then we have the lung cancer immunotherapy, which is still under clinical trials at Roswell Park Cancer Institute. And that was a complete exception. They just snuck in at one specific moment under the Obama administration, and they have managed to protect that collaboration, protect the license that they were granted. But so much more could be done. To save lives in the US, as Vicky says, with the Cuba's infant vaccines for COVID-19. So you probably know that more or less the entire infant population of 2 and upwards has already received a full vaccination schedule. And remember, full vaccination in Cuba is 3 doses from the outset. And they are now in stage 2 clinical trials for vaccines for babies. So from newborn to 2. So, this could save lives, not just in Cuba, not just in the US, but around the world. And so I think what you're doing is really important. And I think that getting that aspect of how it also impacts US citizens is a key as well.
Okay, we have 2 questions remaining. One of them has come in from a YouTube viewer, and that is Doug Morris, who asks, how is the Cuban formal education system operating to maintain and advance socialist consciousness during this extended period when Cuba is confronted with the assault from global capital? And the other question from me, I wanted to follow up on the, here's another question that's come in from Kathleen Densmore. Let me open that up. What has happened in order for Cuba to increase its food production? Are there steps that can be taken while the embargo is in place? And then lastly, I wanted to follow up on my earlier question about the slowness of implementing the reforms. Helen responded to that in terms of the feeling that that they involve the promotion of capitalist individual enterprise. But another area of the reforms, a very important one, was the promotion of cooperatives. Cooperatives recognized as a socialist sector of the economy, and yet Cuba has been very slow in developing cooperatives. Why is that?
Shall I respond to those now?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I obviously, when I was answering the question about, you know, the slowness of reforms, I forgot about, Cliff, your important work on Cuban cooperatives. So I will address it now. I mean, I agree with you and others who have noted that this was supposed to be a key pinnacle of the reforms of shifting the structure of employment in Cuba and having far less state employment, with the state responsible for providing all resources and paying all salaries and so on, in a scenario of very low productivity, and shifting employment to other sectors, which was supposed to be cooperatives, a key element. And yeah, you're absolutely right that it got to about 500 non-agricultural cooperatives. Of course, we're talking about non-agricultural cooperatives because Cuba has a long history of agricultural cooperatives, which have actually proven to have higher productivity than the state farms. And it got to around 500, and then there was the freezing of the granting of licenses, and then I don't believe that much more progress has been made in that sphere, and I'm not sure why, because when I've looked at it, you know, for my book, I looked at, you know, some of the cooperatives in construction, and they seem to be doing remarkably well. So that's not something I have a specific answer for, I'm afraid. I'll leave that for your investigation. In terms of food production, lots is being done to try and increase food production, but it seems an intractable problem. And there are big issues outside of Cuba's control, for example, climate change. And I guess, you know, really when I co-produced the documentary last year on climate change is when I really understood the extent to which Cuba has been affected by, we know about hurricanes, right? Because it's in the news, but by droughts, by cyclical droughts that last sometimes 4 years, right? So these are cycles. And they've had droughts in the last 10, 20 years where they've had to transport water to half of the island's population because the reserves just ran out. If you think about, you know, Andres made a point about Cuba being an island, right? And, you know, he said no walls. I was going to say to you, well, there is a wall in Cuba. It's Guantanamo, where the US is illegally occupying. And we tend to forget that, but it is there. They are physically occupying Cuba against the will of the Cuban people. But you know, being an island means, where does their fresh water come from, right? It's a problem. It comes from rain. So when there are, you know, an underwater supplies and all the rest of it, and when there is a drought, that very quickly impacts their reserves of fresh water. And the other issue with the rising sea waters is that it gets into the underwater aquifers and you have a problem of salination. So water scarcity and water availability is a massive impact, which also affects agriculture, because agriculture requires a lot of water. And the Cubans have tried to reduce their imports of rice, which is one of the biggest in that group of imports that I mentioned, is one of the biggest costs is rice, because you have this historically emerged situation, which is rather ridiculous. Luis Perez has written on this in his wonderful book, I recommend, Rice in a Time of Sugar, about this phenomena by the 19th century where Cubans are, as a population, culturally addicted to rice. I mean, that's one of their main staples, and yet it's a product that they can't produce for their own consumption. So, you know, they're relying on imports. When they have tried to produce rice, the issue of water is again there. So food production, yeah, they have carried out this campaign of distributing idle state land in usufruct, which Raúl initiated in 2008. That was one of the first reforms under Raúl, and other measures that have been taken. And a lot of it is to do with the commercialization and incentives. But there are also broader questions. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it sounds like everyone here has at some point been on a solidarity brigade to Cuba. And so you've probably been into the fields and picked coffee beans, or, you know, tried to chop sugarcane, or nearly injured someone with a machete at some point. And it's hard work, right? It's hard work in the Caribbean sun, in the, you know, especially in the summer. And, you know, how do you get people to stay and work on the land when education is free and they can, you know, go and become professionals, not necessarily even move to cities, right? They can stay in small towns and villages and so on, where we know there are doctors and professionals of all sorts all over Cuba. So those are very big challenges. But what is clear is they are going to have to work very hard at this, and they are prioritizing it. And every time, you know, you have a speech about national development plan, food sustainability is up among them. I mean, one of the things that has happened globally, I talked about the global price rises, is the rise in wheat. And wheat is one of the key imports that Cuba makes. So, you know, they are going to have to probably consider working quite hard at changing, and it's a cultural question, changing diets as well as trying to solve this problem. But, you know, if you get the opportunity, if you haven't already watched the documentary that we did on climate change, it's clear that everything is going to have to change. I mean, agriculture will be impacted because the whole climate is already going under transition, and that affects the kind of products and crops you can produce, the kind of livestock that can live. Because if they have the predicted heat level rises, then, you know, pork might not be able to survive, and pork is another staple in Cuba. Sugarcane, it will be too hot for. So, you know, there's a really, they are, one thing they're very good at is, because they have this integral approach, is that they are building policy which impacts all of these things on the basis of scientific analysis. So this is science-led policy making, and you know, that they are aware of these problems, but they are very difficult to solve. I should say, however, that most urban areas in Cuba are either 100% or close to being self-sustaining in fruit and vegetables. So that's a very good sign. They have made some progress in that regard, but a lot more work needs to be done. And they need to find solutions to some very complicated problems. And again, we go back to the US blockade, because new technologies require massive investments, and that is a question of accessing both the capital to purchase them, but also the technology itself. And you probably all know that part of US legislation, blockade legislation, says that any piece of equipment or good produced anywhere in the world cannot be exported to Cuba if 10% or more of its components are made by a US company or a subsidiary even of a US company. So, you know, even when you talk about agriculture, it requires seeds, fertilizers, but whether it's biofertilizers, it requires equipment, and for drainage and watering and all sorts of stuff, which again is impacted by the US blockade. Oh, there was one more question about education and socialist consciousness. I mean, if you've ever seen a school book of a Cuban primary school kid, and you'll see, it's embedded into the whole approach towards education and the value structure. And, the pioneers have their slogan, "We will be like Che." What does it mean to be like Che? Well, it means solidarity, and it means, anti-imperialism and all these things that are built in. So I can't see that that's changed. There is still, a lot of pride in the, as they're known, the conquest or the gains of the Cuban Revolution, right? So in healthcare and education, but also internationalism. So taking that healthcare and education overseas. One thing that I think in terms of education is a newer development, which is very interesting, is embedding the environmental question and specifically climate change into the education system from the earliest level. So that is now part of the primary school curriculum, and school kids go out and they do projects like collecting rubbish from the beaches and helping to plant mangroves, and that goes all the way through the school curriculum. So I personally would say that you can't really have a socialist consciousness without having an environmental consciousness. So I think that's a very big contribution about thinking about consumption, how we consume, how much waste we generate, thinking about production, what are the purposes of production, production for profit versus production that takes into account the impact on the environment and on populations. So that's all it's quite a general question, so I don't know whether that's been answered in terms of that.
Okay, Andres, do you have any final word you want to add?
Just, there are many things people can do, even if they're US citizens within the United States, to kick in the door I was talking about, and including the one on Guantanamo, which actually should be part of any kind of agenda for having open diplomatic relations with Cuba. There's no reason to have that military base there. Of course, there's no reason to have the military base in Vieques either, but in Puerto Rico. What I would say is that the solidarity movements, even just represented here at this meeting today with Saving Lives, show that there's a lot that can be done. There are already a number, as I said earlier, the number of private sector businesses. There's the Bill Richardson Center that has sponsored a number of trips by US business people and elected and appointed officials to Cuba. There are many activities that of solidarity and activity, educational work, trade. There is some humanitarian trade allowed for agricultural products and some health goods. So we need to keep the doors open that exist, and then we need to break open other doors, even with the restrictions of Helms-Burton and the blockade. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andres and Helen, for your very interesting presentations. I should tell people that this has been recorded and will be available on YouTube, as are all of our previous webinars. Go to our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Let me end then by letting you know about our next webinar next Monday. We will hear from Mexican Jose Andres Fuentes on the crisis of civilization. So please join us then. And let me then thank our webinar team, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off till next Monday.